There is a silence that follows the death of a great love. It is not an empty silence. It is a heavy one, filled with the ghosts of unspoken conversations, the echoes of laughter that will never ring again, and the profound, crushing weight of a future that has been irrevocably altered. For 40 years, my world had a son, and its name was Richard Vance. Now, my world was a universe of cold, silent stars. My husband was a titan. To the world, he was the founder of Vance Industries, a man who had built an empire from a single, brilliant idea and an ocean of sheer will. But to me, he was just Richard. The man who hummed off-key while making coffee in the morning. The man who would read poetry to me on rainy Sunday afternoons. The man whose hand always seemed to find mine in a crowded room. A silent, reassuring anchor in the chaos of life. We were not just husband and wife. We were partners in the deepest sense of the word. Every blueprint he designed, every deal he closed, every risk he took, it was all debated, honed, and perfected over our dining room table long after the rest of the world had gone to sleep. I was his silent partner, his secret counsel, the one person who knew the man behind the legend. If you are listening to this, perhaps you too have known a love that defined your world. Please consider subscribing and sharing your own story in the comments, because this is not just a story about a will. It is a story about a legacy, about the blindness of greed, and about a final, brilliant lesson taught by a man who was already gone. The days following Richard's funeral were a blur of black suits, sympathetic murmurs, and casseroles left on the doorstep. Our sprawling home, once a vibrant hub of life and strategy, felt like a museum. Each room a monument to a life that was no longer being lived. Through it all, my son, Ethan, played the part of the grieving heir with practiced perfection. He was 40 now, a man molded not by the struggles that had forged his father, but by the effortless privilege that was its result. He flanked my side at the service, his hand on my arm a gesture of proprietary support rather than genuine comfort. "Are you holding up, Mother?" he'd ask, his voice a perfect imitation of concern. But his eyes, so much like his father's in shape but so different in soul, were already looking past me, scanning the faces of the powerful people in the room, calculating, networking, even in grief. I saw the way he looked at his father's study, at the heavy oak desk where an empire was run. He didn't see a room full of memories, he saw a throne that was now vacant. He loved his father, I suppose, in his own way. But he loved the idea of becoming his father more. The call came a week after the funeral. It was from Alistair Finch, Richard's lawyer and oldest friend. His voice was as dry and precise as the legal documents he so expertly drafted. "Clara," he began, foregoing pleasantries, "I trust you are as well as can be expected." Richard's instructions were very clear. The reading of the last will and testament is to take place this Friday, at 10 in the morning, in my office. Your presence, and Ethan's, is required. A cold dread settled over me. A will. The final, immutable words of the man I loved. For 40 years, Richard and I had never kept secrets. We had a pact, but about his final wishes, he had been uncharacteristically silent. Whenever I had tried to broach the subject, he would simply smile, pat my hand, and say, "Don't you worry, my dear Clara. I've taken care of everything. I've made sure everyone will get exactly what they deserve." His words, meant to be a comfort then, now felt ominous, heavy with a meaning I couldn't yet grasp. When I told Ethan about the appointment, his reaction was telling. A flicker of something sharp and hungry passed through his eyes before he masked it with a somber nod. "Of course," he said, "we must honor Father's final wishes. I'll pick you up, Mother. We'll go together, as a family." That word, family, felt strange in his mouth. Since his marriage to a woman whose only ambition was to climb the social ladder, Ethan's definition of family had become narrower, more exclusive. I was an accessory to be brought out on holidays, a living link to a legacy he was eager to claim. But the woman herself, the mother who had raised him, he seemed to know less and less. On the morning of the reading, Ethan arrived at the house. He walked through the familiar rooms with the air of an appraiser. He ran a hand over the mahogany dining table. "We'll have to get rid of this," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "It's far too traditional." He looked at the paintings Richard and I had collected over a lifetime of travels. And these walls need a more modern aesthetic. He was already redecorating my life, and my husband wasn't even cold in the ground. The drive to the lawyer's office was silent. I looked out the window at the city flashing by, a city whose skyline was dotted with buildings that Vance Industries had built. Richard's legacy was everywhere. And soon, I knew it would all belong to my son. I had never cared for the money or the power. My wealth had been Richard's presence. Without him, all the gold in the world felt like dust. All I hoped for was to be allowed to live out my days in our home, surrounded by the memories we had made. A small, simple wish, I thought. Alistair Finch's office was exactly as I remembered it. A quiet, hallowed space, filled with the scent of old leather and paper. Bookshelves reached to the ceiling, filled with law books that stood like silent soldiers, guarding the secrets of the city's most powerful families. Alistair, a tall, slender man with a shock of white hair that belied his sharp, intelligent eyes, greeted us with a solemn nod. "Clara, Ethan, please, be seated." We sat in two heavy leather chairs facing his massive desk. Between us, a single, thick, cream-colored envelope lay waiting. It felt less like a document and more like a gravestone. Alistair cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Before we begin," he said, looking over his spectacles at both of us, "I want to state for the record that I advised Richard on the legal ramifications of this will, but the contents, in their entirety, are his own. He was a man of specific intentions." Ethan gave a confident, almost condescending smile. "My father was always clear about the future of his legacy. I'm ready." I, on the other hand, was not ready. I felt a tremor in my hands. This was it. The final chapter of my life with Richard, a chapter he had written, but one that I would have to live. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for his last words, praying they would be kind. But as I glanced at my son's eager, impatient face, I had a sudden, terrifying premonition that kindness was not on the agenda today. Alistair Finch placed a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses on the bridge of his nose. He picked up a heavy, ornate letter opener, a gift from Richard years ago, and with a slow, deliberate movement, he slid open the thick, cream-colored envelope. The sound, a soft, tearing whisper, felt like a final, irreversible severing of my connection to the man I loved. He withdrew a multi-page document, its pages bound by a simple blue ribbon. He untied the ribbon with practiced, precise movements, his face an impassive mask that betrayed no hint of the emotional devastation he was about to unleash. "This," he began, his voice a dry, formal monotone, "is the last will and testament of Richard Allen Vance, executed on the 3rd of March of this year and witnessed by myself and my associate. It is, to my certain knowledge, his final and most current declaration of intent." He cleared his throat. "I will now read the primary articles of distribution." I braced myself, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles ached. Beside me, I could feel Ethan shifting in his chair, leaning forward almost imperceptibly, a predator sensing the final moments before a feast. Article 1, Alistair read, regarding my personal effects and sentimental possessions. To my beloved wife, Clara Vance, I leave the entirety of my personal library, including all first editions, and the small, hand-carved wooden bird I purchased on our first trip to Vienna. It is my wish that these bring her the same comfort they have always brought me. My heart sank, but I forced a small, sad smile. The library. Of course, it was our sanctuary, the place where we had spent countless hours. And the little wooden bird? It sat on his bedside table. It was the last thing he saw every night. It was a sweet, deeply personal gesture. But as Alistair continued, a cold dread began to creep up my spine. It felt small, final, like a beautifully written footnote at the end of a very long book. Article 2, Alistair continued, his voice unchanging, regarding all liquid assets, including all personal and joint bank accounts, savings, trusts, and investment portfolios held by Vance Industries and by myself personally, I direct that these be consolidated and transferred in their entirety to my son, Ethan Richard Vance. I heard Ethan let out a soft, almost inaudible exhale beside me. It was the sound of victory. I, on the other hand, felt a strange sense of dislocation. Our joint accounts? The savings we had built together over 40 years? The money was not the point. It was the erasure. It was as if 40 years of partnership had been reduced to a simple, one-way transaction. Alistair didn't pause. Article 3. Regarding all real estate holdings. I bequeath the penthouse apartment on Park Avenue, the summer estate in the Hamptons, the ski chalet in Aspen, and the villa in Tuscany, along with all their contents, to my son, Ethan Richard Vance. He kept reading. The list went on and on. Art collections, a fleet of classic cars, the yacht. With each word, I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller and more insignificant. Ethan, in contrast, seemed to grow larger in his chair, puffing up with a sense of entitlement so immense it was almost a physical presence in the room. He was trying to appear somber, but a smug, triumphant smile was playing at the corners of his mouth. I clung to a single, desperate hope: the house, our home, the place where we had raised our son, where every corner held a memory. Surely, Richard would not take that from me. Article 4, Alistair said, his eyes still fixed on the page. Regarding our primary residence at 14 Elmwood Drive. It has been my greatest joy to call this place home, a sanctuary built with my beloved Clara. It is my final wish that the property be transferred, free and clear of all encumbrances, to my son, Ethan Richard Vance. And there it was, the final blow. I felt the air leave my lungs in a silent gasp. My home, my memories, my last remaining sanctuary, all given to Ethan. I was to become a guest in my own life. I risked a glance at my son. The last vestige of feigned sadness had vanished from his face. It was now replaced with a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. He wasn't just wealthy now, he was the patriarch. He had won. Finally, Alistair said, turning to the last page. Article 5. All remaining assets, tangible and intangible, not otherwise specified in this document, shall pass to my son, Ethan Richard Vance. This concludes the primary articles of the will. He folded the document neatly and placed it on the desk. The silence that fell was heavy and absolute. I felt numb, adrift in a sea of shock and disbelief. This couldn't be Richard's will. The man I knew, the man who had cherished and protected me for 4 decades, would never do this. He would never leave me, homeless, adrift, utterly dependent on the whims of a son who clearly held me in such low esteem. It was a character assassination from beyond the grave. Ethan was the one to break the silence. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a gesture of finality. He looked down at me, and for the first time he made no effort to hide his true feelings. His face was a mask of condescending pity. "Well, mother?" he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. It seems father was a very traditional man after all. He knew that these complex matters are best left in the hands of those who understand them. He gestured vaguely around the office. Business, finance. These things were never your strong suit, were they? I couldn't speak. My throat was tight with unshed tears. "Don't you worry," he continued, the false concern in his voice more insulting than any overt cruelty. "I'll make sure you're taken care of. We can find you a nice little apartment somewhere. Something manageable for you. Of course, we'll have to sell the house. It's far too large for one person, and its capital is needed for new ventures." He was already liquidating my life. My home was now capital. My memories were now an asset to be leveraged. I looked at this man, this stranger who wore my son's face, and I felt a grief that was somehow sharper and more immediate than the grief I felt for my dead husband. Richard was gone, but this was a betrayal. It was a cold, calculated dismantling of everything we had ever built together. And it was being done by our own flesh and blood. I remained seated, the leather of the chair cold against my back, feeling as though I had been hollowed out. The man standing before me, my son, was a stranger. His words were not the clumsy, ill-considered remarks of a young man drunk on newfound power. They were the precise, surgical strikes of someone who had been waiting for this moment, someone who had rehearsed this speech in the quiet, greedy corners of his own mind. He was not just accepting his inheritance, he was asserting his dominance, and my humiliation was a necessary part of that coronation. Alistair Finch, the lawyer, sat behind his desk, his face a perfect, unreadable slate. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched, his stillness a silent testament to the grim proceedings. Ethan took a step closer to me, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial tone, as if he were sharing a friendly piece of advice. "You see, Mother," he said, the word mother now dripping with a condescending patronage. "Father built an empire, and empires need emperors, not museum curators." He smiled, clearly pleased with his own analogy. "You were his wife, and that was a role you played beautifully. But your role in the company, in the real world, well, it was non-existent, wasn't it? You arranged the dinner parties, I make the deals. It's the natural order of things." Every word was a twisting knife. Non-existent. 40 years of late-night strategy sessions, of proofreading his contracts, of being the sounding board for his wildest ambitions, of talking him down from ledges of doubt and despair. 40 years of being the silent, uncredited architect of his confidence, the co-author of his success. All of it, in my son's eyes, amounted to nothing more than flower arrangements and guest lists. He saw my contribution not as foundational, but as decorative. I finally found my voice, though it was a thin, ragged whisper. "Your father and I, we built everything together, Ethan." He laughed. It was not a loud laugh, but it was the cruelest sound I had ever heard. It was a short, sharp bark of incredulous amusement, filled with a genuine disbelief that I could possibly harbor such a delusion. "Oh, Mother, please," he said, shaking his head as if chiding a foolish child. "Don't be sentimental. You were a homemaker, a wonderful one, I'm sure. But you know nothing about the complexities of global logistics, of hostile takeovers, of the world Father actually lived in." He waved a dismissive hand. "You get nothing from the will because you were nothing to the company. Father knew that. And now, so do you." That was it, the final, brutal truth of how he saw me. Not as a partner, not even as a person, but as a zero, a null set. The pain was so sharp, so absolute, that it transcended tears. It was a cold, hard certainty that settled in my bones. The son I had raised was gone. In his place stood this callous, gilded stranger. He then turned away from me, beginning to pace the room as if he already owned it, his mind buzzing with plans. "Alistair," he said, not even looking at the lawyer, "I want you to begin the process of liquidating some of the minor assets immediately. The art collection, for a start, it's too classical. Tastes have changed. And the Hamptons estate, the upkeep is absurd, and I prefer the Caribbean anyway." He was talking about selling Richard's passions. My husband had spent decades curating that art collection. Each piece had a story. He adored the old house in the Hamptons, the way the sea salt weathered the shingles, the sound of the waves at night. Ethan was erasing my husband, piece by piece, right in front of my eyes, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. "And of course," Ethan continued, a new, sharper edge to his voice, "we need to have a serious conversation about the leadership at Vance Industries. Father was too sentimental. He kept too many loyalists on the payroll, men from the old days. The company needs a new vision, my vision. He was going to purge the company of the very people who had helped his father build it, the people who embodied its soul, its history. He was going to strip it bare and rebuild it in his own arrogant image." I felt a sudden, desperate urge to protect my husband's legacy. It was a primal instinct, rising through the fog of my grief and shock. I had to do something. I looked at Alistair, a silent appeal in my eyes. The lawyer remained impassive, but for a fraction of a second, his gaze met mine, and I saw something flicker there. It wasn't pity. It was anticipation. Ethan, finished with his pronouncements, finally turned back to me. He pulled out his wallet, a sleek, black thing made of alligator skin. He extracted a credit card and placed it on the desk in front of me. "Here," he said, his voice softening into a grotesque imitation of kindness. "For your expenses. Find a nice place. Get yourself settled. Just try to stay out of the way. I have a lot of work to do." That was the final indignity. To be paid off, to be dismissed like a retired servant, given a small pension for my years of service. The cold plastic of the credit card felt like a brand against my skin. I couldn't take it anymore. I slowly, deliberately, pushed the credit card back across the polished mahogany desk. "I don't want your money, Ethan," I said, my voice quiet but firm. He looked genuinely surprised. "Don't be proud, Mother. You have nothing." "I have my dignity," I replied, "something you wouldn't understand." For the first time, a flash of real anger appeared in his eyes. He saw my refusal not as a point of pride, but as an act of defiance. A final, futile gesture from a queen who had already been checkmated. He let out a sigh of exasperation. "Fine, suit yourself, but don't come crying to me when you realize what nothing really feels like." He turned to leave, his shoulders squared, a king leaving his conquered territory. My heart had shattered into a million pieces. My husband was gone. My son was a monster. My home was being sold. My life, as I knew it, was over. I had lost everything. Ethan had his hand on the ornate brass doorknob of the office, ready to step out into his new, inherited world. He was done with me, done with the past. In his mind, the final transaction was complete. I sat there, a statue carved from grief, preparing myself for the daunting task of standing up and walking out into the ruins of my own life. I had to decide where to go, what to do. The simple logistics of survival felt like insurmountable mountains. How do you start over at 68 with nothing but a broken heart and a library of old books? My entire being was focused on the simple, mechanical act of placing my hands on the arms of the chair to push myself up. It was in that precise moment, a moment suspended between utter despair and the grim necessity of moving forward, that Alistair Finch finally spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the oppressive silence of the room like a judge's gavel. "Mr. Vance," he said, his tone crisp and authoritative, "I would advise you to resume your seat." Ethan paused, his back to us. He turned his head slightly, an expression of annoyed impatience on his face. "Is there something else, Alistair? I believe our business is concluded. I have a company to run." The arrogance in his voice was breathtaking. "Our business is not concluded," Alistair replied, his voice taking on a new, harder edge. He did not raise it, but its intensity seemed to lower the temperature in the room. Richard's final instructions were meticulous. "There is another matter to attend to." I lowered myself back into the chair, my body acting on some instinct I didn't know I possessed. A flicker of confusion pierced through the fog of my pain. Another matter? What could possibly be left? Ethan let out an audible sigh and reluctantly turned around, walking back to his chair with the air of a king being forced to entertain a court jester. He did not sit, but stood beside it, tapping his fingers impatiently on the leather backrest. "Well, what is it? Some charitable donation he forgot to mention? A bequest to an old college friend?" Alistair Finch ignored him completely. His gaze was fixed on the large, leather-bound blotter on his desk. He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew something that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a second envelope. This one was different from the first. It was smaller, made of a thick, heavy, navy blue parchment, and it was sealed not with a simple lick of glue, but with a deep, red wax seal, impressed with the Vance family crest, an old, intricate design that Richard had always been so proud of. "Before his passing," Alistair explained, his voice taking on a formal, almost ceremonial quality, "Richard Vance prepared a final codicil to his will, an addendum. It was entrusted to me with the explicit instruction that it was to be opened and read only after the primary will had been executed in its entirety, and only in the presence of both parties." He held up the envelope. I could see my name, Clara, written on the front in my husband's familiar, strong handwriting. And below it, a single chilling instruction, to be read last. Ethan stared at the envelope, his dismissive arrogance finally giving way to a flicker of genuine curiosity mixed with suspicion. "A codicil? What could possibly be in there?" He already gave away everything. "Not everything, it would seem," Alistair said dryly. He picked up the same ornate letter opener he had used before. This time, he didn't slit the envelope. He carefully used the tip of the blade to crack the wax seal. The small, sharp snap echoed in the silent room. It sounded like a key turning in a very old lock. He reached into the navy blue envelope and pulled out not a formal legal document, but a single, folded piece of the same heavy parchment. It was a letter, a personal letter. My heart began to pound, a frantic, hopeful rhythm against my ribs. What was this? A final love letter? An explanation? An apology for the cruelty of the first will? Alistair unfolded the paper. He adjusted his spectacles. He looked at Ethan, then at me, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of something deeply human in the old lawyer's eyes. It was a look of profound, solemn respect. "The letter is from Richard," he said, his voice softening slightly. "It is addressed to you, Clara, but his instructions were that I am to be the one to read it aloud." Ethan scoffed. "Oh, for goodness sake, a sentimental farewell. Can we please get on with this?" Alistair pinned him with a glare so cold and sharp it seemed to silence the air around him. "Your father's last words deserve your respect, Ethan. I suggest you grant it to them." Ethan, for the first time, seemed to shrink slightly under the lawyer's authority. He fell silent, crossing his arms in a gesture of petulant defiance. Alistair cleared his throat and began to read. The words that came out of his mouth were not his own. They were the words of my husband. I could hear Richard's voice in the cadence, in the choice of each carefully considered word. It was as if he were in the room with us, speaking from beyond the veil. He read, "My dearest Clara," the letter began. "If you are hearing this, it means I am gone, and it also means that our son has just revealed the true nature of his character. I am sorry, my love, that you had to endure that final, painful test. But it was necessary. For 40 years, you were the bedrock upon which I built our life and our company. You were the strategist to my visionary, the anchor to my storm. Your wisdom was my most valuable asset, a truth our son, in his arrogance, has never been able to see." I held my breath. What did he mean? A test? Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "What is this nonsense?" he muttered. Alistair continued reading, his voice unwavering. "I have left our son the fruits of my labor, the money, the houses, the toys. They are trinkets, and I fear he will squander them, but they are what he values, and so they are his to have. But a great company, a legacy, is not made of trinkets. It is a living thing. It has a heart, and a soul, and a mind. And that, my darling Clara, is what I leave to you." The air in the room grew thick with tension. I could feel the world tilting on its axis. Alistair took a deep breath and read the final fateful sentence of my husband's last letter. The world seemed to hold its breath. Alistair Finch's voice, imbued with the full weight of my husband's final, brilliant maneuver, rang out in the silent office, clear and absolute. "And so," he read, his eyes lifting from the page to look directly at me, "to my brilliant wife, my silent partner, Clara Vance, I leave the one thing that truly matters, control." The word hung in the air, a single syllable that shattered the reality of the room and rebuilt it in a new, stunning configuration. Alistair lowered the letter and picked up a second, more formal document that had been tucked behind it in the envelope. "Accompanying this letter," he announced, his voice reverting to its formal, legal tone, "is a legally binding addendum to the will. It stipulates the following. Effective immediately, 100% of the voting shares of Vance Industries are transferred to Clara Vance. Furthermore, by unanimous, unchallengeable, and final decree of the founder, she is hereby appointed to the position of chairman of the board. All executive decisions, hirings, firings, and corporate strategies are subject to her final approval." He placed the document on the desk with a soft, definitive thud. "Congratulations, Madam Chairman. The company is yours." I stared at him, the words washing over me, a tidal wave of shock and dawning, electrifying understanding. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. Richard, my brilliant, cunning husband, had seen it all. He had seen Ethan's greed, his disrespect, his utter blindness to my true role in our life. This wasn't a punishment from the grave. It was a masterclass, a final, perfectly executed business lesson. He hadn't disinherited his son. He had simply put him on a performance review. And he had made me the boss. All the air seemed to rush out of Ethan. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, grayish pallor. His arrogant posture collapsed, and he sank heavily into the chair he had been leaning on. "What?" he whispered, his voice a hoarse, strangled sound. "Number, that's not possible. The assets, the money. It's all mine. He gave it to me." "Indeed, he did," Alistair said calmly. "Richard left you the money, Ethan. He left your mother the source of the money. He left you the golden eggs. He left her the goose." He folded his hands on the desk. "You are, as of this moment, the wealthiest employee of Vance Industries, but an employee nonetheless. An employee who serves at the pleasure of the new chairman." The irony was so sharp, so exquisitely perfect, it was almost poetic. I was no longer the penniless widow. I was the power. The houses, the cars, the bank accounts, they were all Ethan's, but his ability to keep them, to fund the lavish lifestyle they required, now depended entirely on his salary. A salary that I, his mother, would now control. Ethan looked at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, panicked horror. He was seeing me for the first time. Not as his mother, not as a decorative homemaker, but as the single most powerful person in his world. The woman he had just called a nobody. "Mother," he began, his voice trembling. "This is a mistake, a misunderstanding. You don't want this. The pressure, the responsibility. You should just sign it over to me. We can run it together." The offer was so pathetic, so transparent in its desperation, that for the first time since Richard died, I felt a genuine, unbidden smile touch my lips. The fog of grief and shock had finally lifted, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. The woman who had walked into this office had been a victim. The woman who would walk out would be a queen. I stood up. I felt a strength in my legs, a power in my posture that I hadn't felt in years. I smoothed the fabric of my simple dress, which no longer felt inadequate, but like the uniform of a woman who had nothing to prove. I looked down at my son who had laughed in the face of my grief, my son who had deemed me a failure. "No, Ethan," I said, my voice quiet, calm, and utterly resolute. "We will not be running it together. Your father, in his infinite wisdom, has given me a job to do. And I intend to do it. His legacy, our legacy, will be protected." I turned to Alistair. "Alistair," I said, my voice now carrying a note of command that felt surprisingly natural. "My first act as chairman is to call a full emergency board meeting for 9 a.m. Monday morning. I want a complete review of all of Ethan's proposed new ventures. It seems some loyalists from the old days need to be reassured that the soul of this company is not for sale." Alistair Finch, for the first time, allowed a small, satisfied smile to grace his lips. "It will be my absolute pleasure, Madam Chairman." I then looked back at Ethan. His face was a ruin of shattered arrogance and dawning terror. He had gotten everything he thought he wanted, only to realize he had lost the one thing that truly mattered. "As for you, Ethan," I continued, my voice as cool and clear as ice, "your position as CEO will be under review. I suggest you spend the weekend preparing a presentation. A presentation on what, exactly, you believe the values of this company are. And more importantly, a presentation on why you believe you are still the right person to lead it." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "Don't be late." Without another word, I turned and walked toward the door. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vengeful. I felt centered. Richard had not left me a burden. He had left me a purpose. He had given me a final, profound gift, the chance to become the woman he had always seen when he looked at me. As I opened the door to leave, I paused and looked back at my son one last time. He was still sitting there, utterly broken, a wealthy man who had just discovered he was, in fact, completely bankrupt. "Oh, and Ethan," I said, a final thought occurring to me. "About the house. Don't worry about selling it. I've decided to keep it. You'll need to find your own place. Something manageable for you." And with that, I walked out of the office, leaving the silence, the shock, and the past behind me. I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, not as Clara Vance, the grieving widow, but as Clara Vance, the chairman. My work was just beginning. Thank you for listening to my story. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your own story in the comments below. Your voice, believe me, always matters.